It began like any other taping day, until everything stopped. The lights carved clean circles on the polished floor, the theme music faded into a warm hush, and the laughter that usually ran like electricity through the audience softened into expectation. Steve Harvey walked to his mark with that easy stride people recognize before they know why they're smiling, cards in one hand, the other lifted in a small wave that felt like a promise. Families stood shoulder to shoulder behind their podiums, hands poised, hearts louder than the band. Somewhere in the rafters, a camera whispered across its track. Somewhere in the crowd, a little girl clutched the edge of her seat without knowing that her name would soon be a kind of prayer. The board flashed its first question. Steve cracked a joke. The red buzzers gleamed like cherries in a bowl. On television, moments like these blur into one another, safe, familiar, predictable. But sometimes a thread is pulled and the whole fabric breathes. He looked up from the card and saw a man at the far podium who wasn't looking at the board, or the lights, or even at him. The man's eyes were searching the rows beyond the stage as if he'd heard a voice only he could hear. He had the careful posture of someone rebuilding his life, shoulders square but not yet settled. His nameplate read Martin, a simple navy suit that looked borrowed from a better day. His left hand drifted toward his jacket pocket and then thought better of it, as if touching whatever was inside might break him open. When he smiled, it was the smile people were to keep from sinking, sturdy, practiced, grateful for solid ground. Y'all ready? Steve asked, warmth spreading through the syllables. Heads nodded. Applause sprinkled the air. The band hit a playful flourish. Steve read the question. A buzzer snapped. Laughter rose and fell. The show moved the way a river moves when it knows its route to the sea. But the searching never left Martin's eyes. Between answers, he kept scanning the audience with a small tilt of his head, like a man listening for footsteps that belonged to another life. On screen, it would have looked like nerves. In the room, it felt like an ache held politely. During a cutaway, Steve glanced toward his producer's station. Years of reading people had taught him to catch the music under the noise. Something was off, a beat behind the beat. A stage manager pointed discreetly toward the audience right. A seat had been left empty on purpose. A woman in black clutched a purse to her chest, knuckles pale. Next to her, a young usher stood alert, one finger pressed to an earpiece, as if the next cue were more important than the rest. Steve turned back to the families. The camera's red tally light blinked alive. The show resumed. The question on the board hung like a lantern. Name something you never stop listening for. Voices fired. Footsteps. Your child's cry. Your heartbeat. The room chuckled at the last one. Steve rolled his eyes, played the beat, and the audience loved him for it. Martin's turn came. His hand hovered over the buzzer as though it could feel more than plastic and springs. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His teammates looked down the line, encouraging, unaware that courage sometimes looks like silence. He swallowed. The clock ticked. Somewhere in the rigging a light hummed. Martin, Steve said gently. What you got, man? The word he spoke next was not an answer to the question on the board. It was a name. Soft at first, careful, almost apologetic for taking up space. Lena. A ripple moved through the front rows. The woman in black pressed the purse harder against her chest. Steve's face changed the way a sky changes before rain. Not darker, just deeper. He stepped closer to Martin without losing the showman's smile, as if he could shield a private moment with professional ease. Who's Lena? Steve asked, voice lowered so the microphones had to lean in. My daughter, Martin said, and the syllables seemed to steady him. 8 the last time I saw her. He blinked the way people blink when they're deciding whether to keep going. The lights felt brighter. The floor felt glassy under every shoe. Even you, if you had been in that room, would have held your breath without meaning to. Steve nodded once, a small permission. All right, he said, as if the game could wait for whatever mattered more than points. All right. Silence arrived like a guest everyone respected. The cameras found angles and then stopped moving, as if motion itself might disturb something sacred. The audience, hundreds of strangers with nothing in common but tickets and curiosity, leaned into the same heartbeat. On the bandstand, a drummer lifted his sticks from the snare and set them quietly on a towel. Martin's hand left the buzzer and settled, palm flat, on the podium top. "I promised I would find her," he said to no one and to everyone, a plain sentence with edges worn smooth by years. "I promised I wouldn't stop listening." Steve's eyes went to the empty seat, then back to Martin, a question forming that he didn't ask. He folded the cue cards, not because he had finished with them, but because paper sometimes needs to be still when a soul is speaking. Somewhere backstage a headset crackled. Somewhere beyond the studio doors, footsteps were already on their way. Sometimes, 1 second is enough to make an entire studio fall silent. This was that second. The scoreboard washed itself to black. The audience screens dimmed, leaving faces lit by the kind of light that makes tears look like the truest thing. Steve took a single step closer, closing the space between host and guest, show and life, laughter and whatever waited. "Say her name one more time," Steve said, so softly it felt like a prayer he had borrowed. "Lena," Martin breathed, and the room seemed to bow its head. Martin had the look of a man who had learned to live with the sound of a door that never quite closes. Before tonight he was a collection of ordinary days threaded together by work, rent due, second-hand furniture, and the quiet rituals that keep a person from unraveling. In the mornings, he brewed coffee in a battered pot and poured a little into a cup that still had a cartoon whale on it. He kept it on the top shelf where it wouldn't chip. It wasn't the cup he used. It was the cup he kept. The cup that, once upon a time, made an 8-year-old laugh because the whale looked like it might blow a sugar cube out of its spout. He never told anyone about the cup. People misunderstand the strange, small altars that love builds. He had not always been the man in a borrowed navy suit. Before there was steadiness, there was a stretch of years he could only describe as too loud. A layoff that came with a cardboard box and a handshake that didn't reach the eyes. A move to a smaller apartment with thin walls and thinning pride. A marriage that had more storms than shelter until one day it became only separate weather systems. A custody schedule written by people who didn't know the smell of his daughter's hair when she fell asleep in the back seat, clutching her stuffed flamingo. Paper can be fair. Life is not paper. Then came a mistake that turned into a misdemeanor that turned into a judge looking over half-moon glasses and saying a number that sounded like a cliff. It was not prison. It was not forever. But it stole seasons, and seasons steal birthdays in a way that calendars can't explain. He did the time. He took the classes they told him to take and the ones nobody notices when you take them, learning how to apologize without asking for anything back. Learning how to fix a leaky faucet because the mind is quieter when the sink is, too. Learning how to walk through the same neighborhood without wearing the map of old habits in your eyes. By the time the number on the judge's lips had spent itself, the world had moved. His ex-wife had changed addresses twice. There were reasons he could not argue with and a few he could not understand. The phone numbers he knew went to recorded voices that were friendly but useless. A forwarding order expired. Then another. He sent a birthday card and it came back wearing a yellow sticker like a bruise. He read the sticker 3 times and still felt he must have misread. He sent another card, then another, and learned that hope is not the same as postage. He did the practical things that grieving people do when they are not allowed to call it grief. He learned about public records. He asked questions in waiting rooms with plastic chairs. He set aside $50 a month and didn't touch it, even when the car made a whining sound on the highway that suggested new belts and bad news. He worked at a small company that installed elevator cabs, polishing metal until his face appeared in it, older and softer and somehow braver. On his lunch breaks he wrote down every memory he could catch. The first time Lena whistled through a missing tooth, the way she said bruiseberry instead of blueberry, for a summer and nobody corrected her. The afternoon they fed breadcrumbs to ducks that were not at all interested but pretended for her sake. A friend at work loved televised laughter and free tickets and surprises. "Come on," the friend said, holding out an extra wristband weeks later. "Let's go watch a taping. You need a night where the only thing you have to carry is your own amusement." Martin said no twice and yes once, and that is how he found himself beneath the bright kindness of studio lights, standing behind a podium with a buzzer that made a cheerful sound when the stage manager tested it. The suit came from a thrift shop where a stranger in a red vest told him he looked like a good man going somewhere important. He knotted his tie 3 times and still it didn't lie quite straight. He left it. Backstage, he answered forms with boxes that asked for things hearts don't come equipped to measure. He wrote in, then stopped, remembering rules about privacy and permission and the difference between longing and logistics. He replaced the letters with a line. When a young producer asked if there was anyone he wanted to say hello to on camera, he smiled and said maybe later, meaning maybe when I can be trusted with my own voice. What nobody told him was that the city has a way of eavesdropping with kindness. A neighbor who had once signed for a package he missed had a sister who volunteered with a youth mentorship program. The sister had a colleague who sometimes sat in the same row at this very studio. Stories, when they want to be found, keep knocking on the same doors until hands remember how to open them. Weeks before this taping, a quiet message had traveled from one inbox to another, then to a binder with a red tab that lived in a producer's bag. The message had 5 sentences in it, none of them demanding, all of them careful. It was not a plea. It was a map. Steve Harvey did not know those sentences when he stepped onto the stage that evening. He knew what he always knows. How to place people where they feel seen, how to lift a room by lifting his eyebrows, how to turn an ordinary answer into a little celebration. But he also knew how to listen for the story a person brings without speaking. He saw a man holding himself upright around a hollow shape, and he recognized the architecture. Between rounds, while applause washed and reset like a tide, a stagehand placed a handset on the judge's table and left it there, face down, the way you set down something that matters and try not to stare. In the second row, the woman in black traced the hem of her sleeve with one finger, as if she could sew time back together by touch. An usher whispered into the earpiece again, and someone beyond the curtain answered. The families on stage were kind the way strangers are kind when they sense they are sharing a room with something tender. Jokes landed softer. Teammates squeezed shoulders a heartbeat longer. Even the scoreboard seemed to glow with less insistence, as if numbers understood they were not in charge tonight. Martin's teammates had only recently become his teammates. Now they were a small circle around a candle you cannot see. During a break, the mother at the end of his line reached into her jacket and pressed a tissue into his palm without making a ceremony of it. He didn't use it. He folded it neatly in half and then in half again, then tucked it where a pocket square might go, something white near his heart in case the night asked for it. You have seen game shows. You have not seen a room lean so carefully toward a man's vow. Steve raised the cue cards for the next segment, then lowered them and let the band fade itself out. He took 2 steps forward and the cameras adjusted as if they had trained their whole lives for this exact adjustment. The red tally light blinked, ready to tell the world a joke. Steve looked at it as if to say, not yet. Then he turned to Martin. Say her name one more time, he had asked, and the name had made a sound like a key. From somewhere behind the curtains came the sound of soft movement, shoes on painted wood, a whisper exchanged in the dark, a cue that only a few in the studio understood. Steve's instinct told him to step slightly aside, to make a space on the stage that wasn't about him. The cameras caught the way he did it. No flourish, just a quiet rearranging of air. The audience, sensing the weight of it, went still without being told. The doors at the far side of the set opened, the way they sometimes did when contestants were called back in. But this time, no music played. For a long breath, no one moved. Then a small figure stepped into the light. First a silhouette, then a shape you could name. A girl, maybe 12 now, in a pale yellow dress that looked like someone had pressed it with care but not with money. She hesitated, 1 foot half behind the other, her hands clenched around a folded note. Steve saw it first, then Martin. Recognition, that long-delayed mercy, crossed the distance between them before either spoke. The kind of recognition that doesn't ask for proof, that just rises like a tide and fills whatever was empty. Martin's mouth opened, but the words didn't arrive. He took a half step forward, then stopped himself, afraid of frightening her, afraid of believing too soon. The studio lights softened to amber. Someone in the control room was crying and didn't try to hide it. The audience began to understand that what they were witnessing wasn't rehearsal, wasn't script, wasn't entertainment. The girl looked to the host, uncertain, and Steve gave her a nod that said, "It's all right, sweetheart, he's right there." She started walking. The note trembled in her fingers. Each step made the room smaller until the distance between them was measured in heartbeats, not meters. Martin dropped to one knee. His hands were shaking the way hands shake when they remember how to hold without hurting. The little girl stopped a few feet away. She unfolded the paper with careful fingers and read from it in a voice that wanted to be brave. "Dear Daddy, I hope you're not mad that I wrote to the show. Mom said you still liked Family Feud. They said you'd be here tonight. I wanted to tell you I'm okay. I still have the whale cup." A sound left Martin that wasn't a sob and wasn't a laugh. It was both, tangled. The audience covered their mouths. Steve pressed a hand to his chest as if to keep something from breaking loose inside. The girl took one more step and Martin met her there, arms around her before she could finish the note. The card fell from her fingers, landing face up on the stage lights. The last line read, "I still listen for your whistle." For a full minute, no one spoke. Cameras rolled, but there are things cameras can't really record. The way a child's shoulders fit under a father's chin, the way relief sounds when it finally gets to breathe. Steve knelt beside them, not to host, but to witness. "You found her, man," he whispered, the words almost lost in the fabric of the moment. Martin nodded against his daughter's hair. "She found me," he said, voice breaking on the last syllable. Somewhere in the audience, a woman's sob rose, then another. It spread like rain that didn't need thunder, only gravity. Steve looked out across the rows of faces, every color, every age, strangers who had come for laughter and instead found something sacred. When the show returned from the break, Steve didn't reach for his cards. He didn't even look at the board. He stood between the podiums, the father and daughter still holding each other, and said, "Sometimes the game can wait. Tonight's about what matters most." Applause came then, hesitant at first, then full, not for winning but for witnessing. The band joined in, soft chords that rose like breath. The scoreboard lit again, not with numbers but with two words the producer had typed without being told. "Welcome home." The girl laughed through her tears, that high clear sound that resets a room. She looked up at Steve. "Can I say something?" "Anything you want," he said. She faced the camera, small hand still caught in her father's sleeve. "If your dad's watching," she said, "don't stop listening. Sometimes we call back." The audience answered with a sound that wasn't applause exactly, more like a heartbeat finding its echo. Steve stepped behind them, one hand on each shoulder, head bowed just enough that his voice came from the same level as theirs. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said softly, "this right here, this is why we do what we do." He didn't mean television. He meant something older, something that hums beneath the noise of every day. The lights dimmed, and the director whispered, "Cut," but nobody moved. The father kept his arms around his daughter as if time itself might try to steal her again. Steve stayed where he was, a silhouette in the glow, the line between host and human blurred beyond repair. When the cameras stopped rolling, no one hurried to pack up the moment. The studio crew, seasoned in the choreography of bright lights and quick resets, moved slower this time, as if afraid that motion might break something sacred. The audience stayed seated, not because anyone told them to, but because leaving would have felt like interrupting a prayer that hadn't yet said amen. Steve motioned for the music to fade, for the band to rest their hands. He reached for a microphone and then changed his mind. His voice didn't need help. It already carried through the stillness. "Let's give them a minute," he said quietly, and 100 strangers obeyed. The girl, Lena, was whispering something into her father's collar. He nodded, still kneeling, still crying, but with a steadiness that looked like the first sunrise after years of rain. Steve turned away for a breath, pretending to fix his tie, to give them privacy. When he looked back, Martin had risen, his arm around his daughter, both of them blinking against the brightness that no longer hurt. A producer slipped onto the stage, headset dangling around her neck. "We can finish the segment later," she murmured to Steve, but he shook his head. "No. The show's finished," he said. "Everything we needed to say just got said." Martin looked around, realizing for the first time that the world had been watching. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw. "I didn't mean to stop everything." Steve laughed softly. "Man, you didn't stop nothing. You just reminded us what this stage is for." He looked to the audience. "We laugh here, we play, we act silly. But sometimes life walks in, and when it does, we stop and make room." The crowd rose to its feet. The applause wasn't thunderous. It was gentle, steady, like waves hitting shore after a long voyage. Lena pressed closer to her father, then surprised everyone by turning toward the audience. "Can I thank you?" she asked Steve. He nodded, stepping back. She lifted the microphone with both hands. "I used to watch this show with Grandma," she said. "She told me Daddy loved it too. When she passed, I thought maybe I could find him here. Grandma said laughter brings people together." The audience began crying openly. A woman in the second row whispered, "It did, baby. It sure did." Martin knelt again beside her, whispering something no mic could catch. Steve could have filled the silence with jokes. He had made a career of easing heavy hearts, but tonight he didn't. He just watched, eyes wet, a smile trembling on his face. Backstage, phones buzzed. The control room, sensing a story larger than airtime, switched to record everything. Wide shots, close-ups, behind-the-scenes footage. Someone whispered, "This is history," and someone else whispered back, "No, it's healing." When father and daughter finally walked off the stage together, Steve followed them into the hallway. No cameras now, no audience, just the echo of footsteps and the low hum of air vents. Martin turned, half embarrassed. "Mr. Harvey, thank you. I don't even know what to say." Steve placed a hand on his shoulder. "You already said it. You showed up. That's the hardest thing." Lena tugged at Steve's sleeve. "Can I tell you a secret?" "Of course, sweetheart." She leaned in close. "I wasn't sure he'd remember me." Steve crouched so they were eye level. "You don't forget your heartbeat," he said. "And you're his heartbeat." Martin wiped his eyes again, laughing at how freely the tears came. "She was 8 when I saw her last. I thought maybe she'd hate me." "She doesn't," Steve said simply. "You showed up, and that's where love starts again." A photographer asked if they wanted a picture. Martin hesitated, then nodded. Lena stood between them, holding her father's hand in one and Steve's in the other. The flash went off, freezing a moment that didn't need preserving but deserved remembering. The show aired a week later. The network debated whether to cut it shorter, to make room for ads, but Steve insisted they run it as it happened. No edits, no narration, no commercial break between promise and fulfillment. When the episode finally hit the air, it did more than draw ratings. Letters arrived, thousands of them, from veterans who hadn't called their sons in years, from mothers who wanted to find the daughters they'd given up, from children who missed the sound of forgiveness. Within days, local news stations replayed the clip. Headlines read, "Family Feud becomes Family Found." The image of Martin kneeling before his daughter appeared on timelines across the world, captioned not with jokes but with simple words, "Love wins again." Steve received a call from the network president. "You realize you stopped mid-show," the man said, half teasing. "I didn't stop anything," Steve replied. "I just let life go live." And maybe you felt it too, the way a single human moment can pierce the noise and remind us what we're made for. In a world that often forgets to look up, a father found his daughter, and for a heartbeat, everyone remembered what hope sounds like. In the reruns, that silence lasts exactly 7 seconds. But if you were there, if you were one of the lucky few in that room, you'd swear it lasted forever. The following week, letters and messages flooded the studio in numbers that no one had seen before. The producers had to bring in extra staff just to sort through them. Handwritten envelopes, emails printed in ink still warm from the machine, even a few small packages. They came from mothers who had lost sons, from fathers estranged from daughters, from people who simply wanted to tell Steve Harvey that for the first time in years, something on television had made them feel human again. Some of the letters were messy, written in shaky cursive, tear stains on the margins. One woman from Detroit wrote, "I watched with my grandson. He asked me if we could find his dad. We're going to try." A man from Nigeria said, "I didn't understand all the words, but I understood the silence." The story had become something larger than a segment. It was a mirror people recognized themselves in. Inside the network building, the clip was replayed so many times that even editors stopped pretending to be detached. They watched the part where Martin said his daughter's name, and every time, someone reached for a tissue. It reminded them that behind the lights and laughter, the show existed because people, at their core, longed to be seen. Steve sat in his office one evening, the studio quiet after another taping. On his desk lay the photograph, Martin kneeling, Lena's hand in his, both smiling through the tears, the words "Welcome Home" glowing behind them. He stared at it, thinking about all the years he had spent making people laugh, about the strange grace that comes when life forgets to follow the script. He remembered how that room had felt, the weight of the hush, the way hundreds of strangers had breathed as one, and he knew this was why he stayed. Not for fame. Not even for the laughter. For these interruptions of love. The phone on his desk buzzed. It was a call from Martin. Steve answered, and Martin's voice came through, unsure at first. "I just wanted to thank you again," he said. "Lena's with me this week. She's sleeping in the next room. We watched the episode together. She laughed when you made that face after the buzzer. She said you look like you're pretending not to cry." Steve chuckled. "She caught me, huh?" "She did," Martin said. His voice trembled, but it wasn't sadness this time, it was awe. "I wanted you to know I got a job offer. A company saw the show and said they wanted people who keep promises." "Look at God," Steve said softly. "That's what I'm talking about." They talked a while longer about school plans and new beginnings, and when Steve hung up, he sat in silence again. Outside his window, the city lights glittered like a promise someone had kept. Weeks later, the production team planned a follow-up. Not for ratings, but because people needed to see what hope looked like when it grew legs. They invited Martin and Lena back, not for another surprise, but to show what came after. When the pair walked out, hand in hand, the applause was quieter than before, but fuller. The audience already knew the story. What they wanted now was the proof that love can stay. Steve greeted them with open arms. "Y'all look good," he said, laughing. "You trying to take my job with all these fan letters?" Lena giggled and held up a drawing. It showed 3 stick figures, a tall one with a mustache, a medium one with a suit, and a small one with a dress. Underneath, in uneven handwriting, she had written, "We're a family now." Steve's eyes softened. "That's the best prize this show ever gave out," he said. The rest of the taping wasn't about competition. The families played together, shared hugs instead of handshakes. Every answer, right or wrong, earned applause. The set had turned into something closer to a church, where laughter and tears coexisted without apology. When the credits rolled, Steve asked the director to keep the cameras running for one last minute. He turned to the crowd and said, "You know, every now and then, we all get a reminder that the world's not as cold as we think. You saw a father find his daughter, but really, what you saw was love remembering itself." He looked straight into the main camera. "If you've got someone out there you ain't talked to in too long, tonight's a good night to fix that. Pick up the phone. Say their name." Then he turned to Martin and Lena. Thank you for reminding us what family really means. The audience rose again, clapping through tears. Lena waved at them shyly, and Martin pulled her close. The lights dimmed. Outside the studio, night had fallen. The cars in the parking lot shimmered under the street lamps, and the air smelled faintly of rain. Steve stood for a moment near the exit, watching father and daughter walk toward their car. Martin lifted his hand in farewell. Lena waved both of hers. They drove away, their taillights twin embers in the dark, small but steady.